The steel door behind the kitchen swung open, and the canvas bag came out first. It hit the wet concrete and split, spilling 2 knives rolled in a towel, a pair of kitchen clogs, and a leather-bound notebook that landed face down in a puddle beside the dumpster. Delaney Marsh came out after it, apron still on, flour still on her hands. She didn't pick up the bag. She knelt, lifted the notebook out of the water, and wiped it against her apron the way a person wipes a child's face. Gerald Prescott filled the doorway. His finger pointed toward the parking lot. "Off this property. Don't come back Monday." 5 years she had stood in that kitchen. 5 years she had written every line of that menu, tasted every pot of stock, kept the name on the sign out front lit up night after night. And tonight she knew why she was being thrown out. She had opened the payroll and found his nephew already on it, hired 6 weeks earlier, titled head chef, paid more than she was. She brought up the $42,000 from her mother's insurance, the money she'd handed him 2 winters back when the restaurant couldn't make payroll, handed over for a promise of 10%. He only shrugged and told her to produce a piece of paper with his signature on it, and then the steel door slammed shut. Delaney stood alone in the alley. She took off her apron, folded it in 4, set it on the lid of the dumpster. She didn't throw it, then bent down and picked up her knives one at a time, dried them, rolled them back into the towel. Across the parking lot, a black car sat against the wall, headlights off, window halfway down. The man inside had been sitting there the whole time. He saw the bag come flying out. He saw the notebook in the puddle. He saw the finger pointed at the gate. He did not open his door. She carried her bag past the hood of that car. The 2 of them held each other's eyes for exactly 2 seconds, and then she kept walking 2 knives and 1 soaked notebook to her name. What she didn't know was that the man owned the building she had just been thrown out of, owned the debt that was choking it, and that her mother's money had been flowing into his pocket for 2 winters, while he had never once asked where it came from. Months later, when her own name hung on a different sign, he would say one thing to her that left her quiet for a long time. "If I'd gotten out of that car, you'd still be standing in that kitchen tonight." If Delaney's story reached you, leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments what you would have done standing in that alley, and subscribe to our channel for the stories still to come. The black car remained pulled close to the wall for a while after her figure disappeared from the parking lot, and only then did its door open. Emmett Kilbride stepped out, turned up the collar of his coat, and passed the apron folded into quarters on the lid of the dumpster. He didn't look at it. He pushed through the steel door that had slammed shut not long before and walked straight through the kitchen while the evening shift was cleaning up, past the pot washers who looked up and then immediately lowered their eyes, down the narrow hallway toward the office at the far end. No one asked who he was. In this neighborhood, people knew his face before they knew his name. Gerald Prescott sat behind his desk, still holding a cup of cold coffee, and when he looked up and saw the man entering, he set it down a little too quickly, making it strike the wood with a dry sound. Emmett didn't greet him. He pulled out a chair, sat opposite him, placed a folder on the desk, and turned it around so the other man could read it. The folder wasn't thick. It held only a few sheets, and the first one bore a number. 3 months, Emmett said. "You're 3 months behind on the lease, and 2 payments behind on the loan. I don't come a second time." His voice wasn't any louder than someone placing an order. There was no pointing finger, no hand striking the desk, no word heavier than the next. That was what made Jerry sweat at the temples. He was used to creditors who shouted. He knew how to manage men who shouted, how to make promises, how to buy himself a few more weeks with a few complaints. The man sitting before him didn't shout, and he didn't look as though he had any need to hear Jerry complain. "I've got several end-of-year banquet contracts," Jerry said. "I just need to get through this season." Emmett took a pen from the inside pocket of his coat, set it beside the folder, and nudged it toward him. "I'm not here to hear a plan," he said. "I'm here for you to sign this. Sign it, and you get another 6 weeks. Don't sign it, and my people come Monday morning to lock the doors, and you can explain it to your customers." Jerry picked up the pen. His hand shook badly enough that the first stroke of his signature went crooked, and he had to write over it. He signed his name 3 times, in 3 marked places, then pushed the folder back. Emmett picked it up, tapped its edges square against the desk, folded it in half, and slipped it into his coat pocket. Then he sat for one more beat, like a man who had just remembered something small. "The woman from earlier," he said. "The one you threw out the back alley." Jerry blinked. He hadn't expected that question. and he hadn't expected the man opposite him to have been outside long enough to see. "My former sous chef," he replied. "She worked here for years. She had some financial problems. I've taken care of it." "What kind of problem?" Emmett asked. His voice remained level, still like a man asking only for the sake of asking. Jerry lifted a hand to straighten his collar. "An internal matter," he said. "The books didn't balance. I didn't want to make a big thing of it, so I let her go quietly." Emmett nodded once. Then he looked down at the desk, where the coffee cup had left a damp circle, and asked his final question. "The winter before last, you paid me $42,000 in one payment. Where did that money come from?" In the brief silence after that question, Gerald Prescott had one chance. He didn't take it. "My money," he said. "I sold some old things." Emmett watched him for another 2 seconds, and within those 2 seconds was a moment when everything might have gone differently. If he had asked one more question, if he had told Jerry to bring out the books, if he had noticed that the woman who had just walked out of that alley carried 2 knives and a wet notebook, not a cent of anyone else's money. But under Emmett Kilbride's rules, once a debtor paid, the matter was finished. He didn't care where people's money came from. He never had. It was what had helped him survive all those years, and it was also the thing he would later understand he could never make amends for. "All right," he said, rising to his feet. 6 weeks, Mr. Prescott." He left without looking back, retracing the path he had taken, through the hallway, through the kitchen, through the steel door. The apron still lay on the dumpster lid, folded into quarters, neat as a flag someone had folded away. This time, he looked at it. He looked for perhaps 1 second, then kept walking toward his car, with not a single question in his mind. Dawn had begun to pale in the east when Delaney slid her key into the lock of the 3rd-floor apartment, and she tried to open the door as quietly as she could, but the kitchen light was already on. Ellis stood there, 16 years old, his hair sticking up on one side from sleep, holding a ladle, while a pot of noodles steamed on the stove. "You came home just in time," he said. "I made 2 servings." She set her bag on the floor, nudged it with her foot into the shadowed corner behind the door, and only then walked toward him. "Why are you up so early?" "I had an assignment due," he said, then took a sheet of paper from his backpack, smoothed it flat, and placed it on the table before her as though he were setting down a dish. 9.2. Only 3 kids in the whole class got above 9. Delaney picked up the paper and read every red note written along the margins, and for that moment, she forgot she had just walked more than 1.25 miles from the restaurant's back alley to get home. "You did really well," she said. The teacher even praised this part. Ellis shrugged in the way of someone trying to look as if he didn't care, though his ears had already turned red. Then he ladled the noodles into 2 bowls and pushed one toward his sister. "Taste it. I added the thing you always put in." She picked up her fork. The noodles had cooked a little too long. The broth was a little too salty, and the egg was overdone. She took 1 bite, nodded, then took another. "It's good," she said. "Next time, just turn the stove off a little sooner." "Really?" "Really." The boy broke into a wide smile, sat down across from her, and finished his own bowl in less than 2 minutes, the way people ate at that age. Then he looked up and saw that she was still wearing her work clothes. "Why are you home so late today?" "The restaurant gave me a few days off," she said, and her voice sounded so ordinary that even she was a little startled by it. "It's busy at the end of the year, so they're rotating people." "So you'll be home tomorrow?" "I guess so." "That's great," he said, rising to carry his bowl to the sink. "Then I'll cook again tomorrow." He went back to bed, leaving his bedroom door partly open, and in the kitchen there was only Delaney, sitting before a bowl of cooling noodles, still holding the paper with the number 9.2 in its upper corner. She stayed that way until full daylight came. 3 days later, she sat at a plastic table in the Free Legal Aid office on Ashland Street, among people holding their files as they waited their turn. The young lawyer across from her read carefully, then read again, the message she had shown him, the message Gerald Prescott had sent her the winter before last, containing exactly 1 line about 10%, and another saying the paperwork would be done the following quarter. "Do you still have anything else?" he asked. "Transfer records," she said. "Dates, times, account numbers." He tapped the tabletop twice with his finger, then handed her phone back. "You have proof that he promised," he said. "You don't have proof that he signed." Delaney looked down at the screen, where those words remained in the same place, unchanged through 2 winters. So that's it. He didn't answer right away. He took out a sheet of paper, wrote down the name of a workers' support organization, slid it toward her, and only then spoke. You can sue, but he has lawyers and you don't. And this could drag on for 2 years without any guarantee it will be finished. I'm telling you honestly because I think you need to know that before you put money into it. She folded the paper in half, slipped it into her coat pocket, thanked him, and stepped onto the sidewalk while people lined up to buy their lunchtime coffee. Less than 2 miles away, in the kitchen of the Ferryman, Trent Prescott wore an apron still sharp with its store creases. He stood in front of the 6-burner range, holding the shift schedule in his hand, and he had been standing there for quite some time. Before him were 3 large pots not yet set on the stove, 2 trays of meat freshly brought from the walk-in cooler, and a thick plastic binder resting on the stainless steel counter. The kitchen assistant beside him asked where he should begin. Trent opened the binder, turned through several pages, then flipped back to the first page. His uncle walked past, stopped, and gave him a pat on the shoulder. Every recipe is in that binder, Jerry said. If you can read it, you can cook it. Then he continued toward the dining room, where the first tables for the evening were being set, and Trent remained alone before the line of burners, not one flame yet lit. She began with the place closest to home, a bistro on Randolph Street with an old wooden sign and 14 tables, where she had eaten lunch a few times and knew the manager by sight. They took her resume, asked what she could cook, listened as she told them, nodded along, asked her to leave her phone number, and said they would call within the week. They called the next day. The call lasted less than a minute. We've just filled the position, Miss Marsh. Best of luck. The second place was a seafood restaurant near the market, where a sign hiring a head chef hung right by the door. They let her into the kitchen, put a knife in her hand, watched her fillet a fish in less than 2 minutes, and the chef there nodded with unmistakable approval, even asked when she could start. The next day, they called. Less than a minute. The third place was a newly opened Italian restaurant. The fourth was the kitchen of a small hotel. The fifth was a catering company where she had once worked a large event not long ago, where someone remembered her name. They were all alike, until they became a rhythm. People were warm when she arrived, praised her when she cooked for them, promised to call, then called exactly 1 day later, with one brief sentence and no explanation. By the 8th place, she had begun to anticipate the voice at the other end before they spoke. By the 10th, she no longer mentioned her 5 years at the Ferryman, because she had realized that every time she said that name, something in the other person's eyes closed. She changed her approach. She said only that she could cook, that she was clean, that she could work nights, mornings, any shift at all, and that she needed a job right away. It was still the same, still exactly 1 day. She had counted 10 names in her notebook when she walked into the 11th place, an established steakhouse on the edge of the West Loop, where the chef was Otis Braddock, a man who had worked the hotline at the Ferryman before moving on, and the only person in the industry who had texted to congratulate her when last autumn's menu was mentioned by the local paper. He made her a cup of coffee, pulled out a chair at the staff table, and did not take her resume. "Sit down," he said. "I'm not taking that, and it isn't because I don't want to." Delaney set the folder at the edge of the table. "Just tell me straight." Otis turned the cup in his hands for a while. "I meant to call you last week," he said. "I really do need someone. I told the office to start the paperwork. Then insurance sent something back to me. There's a file under your name. A theft complaint, with an investigation still open." She sat quietly. Outside the glass door, a delivery truck backed toward the curb, its steady beeping carrying through the afternoon. Otis went on, his voice lower. "You understand how it is. No restaurant hires someone who has a file like that. It isn't because they believe you stole money. I don't believe it. But their insurance won't allow it. And nobody risks an entire restaurant's insurance policy for one person, no matter how good that person is. I can't risk it either." She lifted the cup of coffee, then set it down again without drinking. "How long until it comes off?" "I don't know," he answered. "Maybe a few months. Maybe they close the file without telling you, and you keep applying for jobs like this for another year without understanding why." She stood, thanked him, picked up her folder, and walked toward the door. Otis followed her all the way to the sidewalk, still standing there with a towel draped over his shoulder. Delaney stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, while the lunchtime workers flowed around her on both sides like water around a stone, and she did not cry. She only turned back and asked one question. "Who filed that complaint?" Otis looked at her. Then he slowly shook his head, and she understood that he truly did not know. Not that he knew and would not tell her. "I only saw that there was a file," he said. "They didn't let me see who signed it." She nodded, thanked him once more, then walked toward the bus stop, her folder still tucked beneath her arm, and for the first time since that night in the alley, she understood that what had closed behind her was not a door, it was an entire city. One afternoon, the notice for next month's rent was slipped beneath the door, and that evening Delaney sat counting the money in the grocery envelope, counted it twice, then put the notice away in a drawer Ellis had no reason to open. The following morning, she took a southbound bus, got off in Bridgeport, and walked along a block lined with an old church, an auto repair shop, and a bar called Halloran that had been open since before she was born. She no longer carried her resume. She pushed through the door, asked the man behind the counter whether they needed a dishwasher, and he looked her over from head to toe before jerking his chin toward the back. "Go ask Dermot." Halloran's kitchen was small, with a low ceiling, 2 steel sinks worn bare of their finish, and an exhaust fan overhead that groaned like an old animal. Dermot was chopping onions. Without looking up, he asked whether she could work nights. "Yes." "Ever washed dishes before?" "Yes," she said. He asked whether she had any expectations about pay, and she said no, only that she needed to start today. He looked up at her exactly once, then pointed to a plastic apron hanging from a hook. "Put it on." She stood at the sink from mid-afternoon onward, and by around 7 that evening, the kitchen began to heat up in a different way. 2 more people appeared from somewhere. 3 cases of liquor were carried into the back room, and in the middle of the kitchen, someone set a pot larger than all the other pots combined over the stove. Through the sound of running water, she caught fragments of conversation. "The Kilbride family's party. More than 100 guests. The stock has to be finished before midnight so it can be delivered tomorrow morning." The one cooking it was a young man with his sleeves rolled high, moving quickly and confidently, with the flame turned all the way up. Delaney looked over his shoulder, then back at her dishwater. That pot had already come to a boil once. She had seen foam rise to the rim, seen him skim it away and turn the heat down, then turn it back up again because it was taking too long. Once the stock had gone cloudy, lowering the heat could not bring it back. Her mother had taught her that before she had ever taught her how to hold a knife. Stock was not made with time. It was made with the patience of the person standing beside it. Delaney wiped her hands on her apron, took 2 steps forward, and said only one thing. "If you bring it to a boil again, it'll turn cloudy, and once it does, you can't save it." The whole kitchen turned. The young man laughed, not cruelly, but in the way people laughed when a stranger pointed out something in their work. "You're the dishwasher, right?" "Right." "Then you worry about your sink," he said, turning back to raise the gas another notch, because at that moment there was only one number in his mind: midnight. Delaney returned to her place. She didn't say it a second time. She stood there and washed the stack of pans, then the stack of cutting boards, then the large trays, and while her hands worked, her ears counted. About 20 minutes later, she heard the pot come to a boil for the second time, then the sound of the gas being turned down, then silence. By the time she had washed the final tray and turned around, everyone was standing around that pot, and nobody said a word. The young man dipped in a ladleful and held it up to the light. The liquid in it was the gray color of hand-washing water. It wasn't clear, it wasn't fragrant, and the smell rising from it was the smell of bones that had been cooked too hard. A smell no seasoning could hide. He drew up another ladleful, as if the second one might be different. Dermot came over, bent down to smell it, then straightened and swore under his breath. "How many bones did we use?" "All of them." "How long would it take to make it again?" "There isn't enough time," the young man said, and his voice was nothing like it had been before. "The market opens in the morning. The truck comes at 6. No one in that kitchen looked toward the sink, but a strange silence settled over the room. The kind of silence that came when people remembered that someone had said something, and every one of them had heard it. Delaney took off her gloves and draped them over the edge of the sink. She didn't say, "I told you so." She only stood there, her hands still wet, looking at the pot. And at that very moment, the door to the back room opened at the far end of the kitchen. The man who came out of the back room didn't have to say a word for the whole kitchen to take half a step back. Dermot set down the ladle. The young man beside the pot wiped his forehead with his sleeve, then stopped halfway through the motion. Emmett Kilbride walked to the pot without looking at anyone, bent to smell it once, exactly as Dermot had done moments before, then straightened and said nothing about it, and it was his silence that made the air in the kitchen grow heavy. He turned his head, and his eyes stopped at the sink. Delaney recognized him at once. Not by his face, because that night she had seen only half his face, beyond a window lowered halfway down. She recognized the way he sat still when he should have moved, the way a person could look straight at something happening and not stir. No one in that kitchen had the courage to open their mouth, and the one who did was her. "You parked about 32 feet from me," she said. Dermot spun around. The young man opened his mouth, then shut it again. No one in that kitchen understood what she was talking about, and no one dared ask. Delaney stepped away from the sink, her hands still wet, her plastic apron still streaked with soap suds, and walked straight toward him as though they were the only two people in the room. The lights were off. The window was lowered halfway, she said. "You sat there from beginning to end. You saw my bag fly out. You saw my mother's notebook lying in the water. You saw the finger pointing toward the gate. You saw all of it, and you didn't get out of the car." Her voice wasn't loud. It was simply clear. So clear that the exhaust fan on the ceiling suddenly sounded like the only noise left in the world. Emmett Kilbride said nothing. He didn't frown, step back, raise a hand, or ask who she was, though he knew perfectly well. He looked at her, and there was nothing on his face to suggest he meant to deny it, nor anything to suggest he meant to admit it. Delaney stood there and waited for exactly 3 breaths. Then she understood there would be no answer, and she had no intention of asking one from a man like him. She turned her back, went to the sink, turned on the water, and continued washing the small pot soaking there. Behind her, the silence lasted a little longer. Then came the sound of footsteps, and Emmett's voice, calm as a man placing an order. "Dermot." "Yes, sir." "Set a place for her. The table in the back. Hot." Dermot stood frozen for a second, then moved at once. Delaney didn't turn around. She finished washing the pot, set it on the rack, took off her gloves, and when she turned back, there was a plate of stew, a slice of bread, and a glass of water waiting at the wooden table in the back. She sat down because there was nothing else to do by standing. She didn't pick up her spoon. Emmett passed by her, paused for a moment, but didn't pull out a chair or sit down. "Whether you eat is up to you," he said, "but a hungry person can't think clearly." Then he left. She heard the back room door close, heard the kitchen begin to move again little by little, heard Dermot shout at someone to bring out the bones and see if anything could still be saved, and she sat quietly before that plate of food for a long time. She sat until the fat on top of the stew cooled into a thin film. She thought of the grocery envelope she had counted twice. She thought of the rent notice hidden in the drawer. She thought of Ellis standing in their kitchen that morning, ladling noodles into 2 bowls, and of how tomorrow morning he would ask again whether she was going to work that day. Then she picked up her spoon. She took the first bite and realized the stew was a little under-seasoned. The meat hadn't cooked until tender enough, and the cook had added the carrots too early. She took a second bite, then she ate everything, the slice of bread, the last of the broth at the bottom of the plate, leaving nothing behind. When she stood to carry the plate to the sink, Dermot looked at the plate scraped completely clean in her hand, then at her face, and said nothing at all. He only handed her a dry pair of gloves. The next morning, Dermot told her to keep coming in, and she did, but they left her exactly where she had been. She washed dishes, wiped down the kitchen, carried garbage bins out to the back alley, peeled crates of potatoes, and no one told her to touch a single pan. One day, when the kitchen was short-staffed and a prep cook cut his hand, Dermot still called someone over from the place next door instead of calling her. She didn't ask why. She did her work, rode the bus home near dawn, slept 3 hours, got up to cook for Ellis, then went back again. In the back room, Emmett Kilbride told his people to look into her, and in fewer than 2 days, what was placed on his desk was a sheet printed from an insurance company's system. It bore Delaney Marsh's name, a case number, a line saying the matter was still open, and 2 words, theft complaint. Emmett read it all, folded the sheet, and put it in his desk drawer. He asked nothing more about it. That afternoon, he walked through the kitchen and pulled open the wooden drawer beneath the cutting counter. The drawer everyone in the kitchen knew held change for customers and tips not yet divided, then placed a thick stack of cash inside, pushed the drawer shut, and said nothing to anyone. Delaney worked the night shift at that very counter for 3 straight days. She opened the drawer twice to take out twine, and once to put away the bone shears. She saw the stack of money all 3 times. She pushed the drawer closed all 3 times. On the 3rd day, when the kitchen had been cleaned and half the lights had been turned off, Emmett opened that drawer himself, counted the money with his eyes, then shut it again. He stood there for a while longer in the empty kitchen, then turned to the man beside the door. "Give her the kitchen," the man asked again, just to be certain. "Which kitchen?" "This one. Starting tomorrow." The following morning, Dermot made the announcement in exactly 1 sentence before opening the doors, and no one in the kitchen objected, because people in that bar had learned long ago that once the owner had spoken, there was no room for discussion. That night was the first night Delaney stood before Halloran's line of burners as the person in charge. 4 burners, 2 already lit, a stack of order tickets clipped to the rail at eye level. She tied her apron again, pulled out her knife box, opened the roll of cloth, and placed her hand on the handle of the large knife. Then she couldn't lift it, not because her hand hurt, not because she had forgotten what to do. She knew exactly what to do, knew every movement, knew the order in which to set the pans down, knew what needed high heat and what had to be left alone. But something stood between that knowledge and her hand, and it wasn't fear. It was a sentence. It was 5 years of hearing, again and again, that people came into the ferryman because of the sign outside, not because of her hands, that she was only the person standing there carrying out instructions, that without the name on the door, these 2 hands were nothing. She had heard it so often that she hadn't realized she had picked it up and carried it with her. And now, with no sign hanging above her head, she understood that somewhere along the way, she had believed it. A kitchen assistant stood waiting. An order ticket snapped as another one was added. Delaney said, "I'll be right back," then went into the back room and stood beside the stacked liquor cases, both hands braced against the edge of the table, her eyes lowered to the tile floor. She didn't stand there long, only long enough to hear her heart begin to slow, and long enough to remember something very small, that her mother had never begun with the hardest thing. Her mother began by peeling garlic. Delaney went back into the kitchen. She didn't touch a pan. She pulled the basket of garlic closer, sat on a low stool, and peeled the cloves one by one, loosening the skins with her fingertips and setting them in a bowl. It took a while to finish the basket, and during that time no one dared rush her. Then she stood, pulled the cutting board toward her, took 2 onions, cut them in half, placed the cut sides down against the board, and began to slice. The first cut was a little thick. The second was more even. By the 10th cut, her wrist had remembered its own rhythm. The rhythm no one could teach and no one could take away. And the sound of the knife against the board became as steady as a clock in an old house. She swept the onions aside with the back of the knife. She wiped her hands on her apron. Then she reached up to the shelf, lifted down a pan, and set it over the flame. After she had been running Halloran's kitchen for a few weeks, Emmett called her into the back room, and he didn't waste time with an introduction. "This Saturday, 14 people are eating here. Close the bar. Don't take any customers. You cook." Delaney asked what the menu would be, whether there were any requirements. "1 dish," he said. "Beef stew with potatoes and turnips, the kind poor people make. My mother used to cook it." She asked whether he had a recipe. Emmett looked at her for a moment, then shook his head. She never wrote anything down. She just cooked. "Then what do you want it to taste like?" Delaney asked. He stayed silent long enough for her to understand that he didn't know what he wanted either, and then he gave her one short answer. "Like her." Over the next 3 days, Delaney did something no one at that bar had ever done. She asked questions. She asked Dermot first, because he was the easiest one to ask, and Dermot said the old woman seasoned it salty, truly salty. Salty enough that the children had to drink water constantly, but after they ate it, they felt warm in their stomachs all night. She asked the man at the door everyone called Rudy, and he said the opposite, that the old woman made it sweet because she used so many turnips and onions, simmering them so long they melted away, and gave the broth its natural sweetness without needing anything else. She asked a man named Bergin, whose hands were as large as shovels, and he told her the flavor wasn't the important part. It was the meat, which had to be cut big as a child's fist, because the family was large and everyone had to receive a proper piece for themselves. She asked another man, and all he could remember was that whenever the old woman lifted the lid, the whole house fell silent, because the smell carried pepper and something lightly sour, maybe beer, maybe vinegar. He couldn't remember. The 5th man insisted that she had never used beer. The sixth swore that she had, and argued with the fifth man for quite a while. The seventh was the oldest man in the group, Fallon, well over 70, and he said nothing about ingredients. He only said one thing. She put the pot on the stove in the morning, then kept walking past it, stopping every so often to stir it once. Nobody was allowed to touch that pot, except her. Delaney wrote it all down on a sheet of paper, and that evening she spread it across the table and studied 7 conflicting answers, like 7 people all speaking at once. She sat there for a long time. Then she understood that she wasn't looking for a recipe. She was looking for a woman she had never met through the memories of 7 children who had grown into men. And children's memories didn't record measurements of salt. They recorded feelings. Salty, because the house hadn't had much in those days, so food had to be seasoned heavily to stretch over more rice. Sweet, because turnips were cheaper than meat, so she used plenty of them. Big pieces of meat, because she wanted every child who lifted a spoon to feel that their share was a real share. And the scent when she lifted the lid, the scent of pepper and something faintly sour. Delaney guessed the old woman had used whatever beer the adults had left in their glasses to deglaze the pan, because she didn't want to waste it. So that was how Delaney cooked. She seasoned the meat with pepper, left the pieces large, seared them until they browned, then deglazed the pan with a little dark beer, added twice as many turnips and onions as she normally would, salted it more heavily than she was used to, then left the pot over low heat from early morning onward, walking past it again and again, and stopping now and then to stir it once. She didn't let anyone touch that pot. On Saturday, the bar was closed. 14 men sat around 2 tables pushed together, most of them dressed in dark jackets, most of them saying very little. Emmett sat at the head of the table. Delaney carried out the pot, lifted the lid right there at the table, and ladled out each bowl. Then something happened. No one spoke. No one praised it. No one offered an opinion. 14 men lowered their heads and ate, and the room held only the sound of spoons against bowls, and that sound went on for a long time. Fallon had eaten half his bowl when he set his spoon down. He said nothing, looked at no one, only sat still with both hands resting on the edge of the table. And after a while, he picked up his spoon and continued eating. The man beside him saw it but didn't ask. Emmett finished his bowl, eating slowly, leaving nothing behind. Then he set down his spoon and looked up. "Whose recipe did you cook from?" Delaney stood beside the table, still holding the ladle. "Your mother's," she said. 7 people told me about it, and I put it together." Emmett Kilbride looked at her, and for the first time since that night in the alley, he looked at her as though she were a person, not something that had happened to fall within his line of sight. It happened on an ordinary afternoon before opening, while Delaney was trimming meat at the farthest counter, and the backroom door stood slightly open. The man who had been called in was named Coyle, a man around 50 whom she had seen there since her first day. The man who always sat on the high stool near the bar and was poured drinks without ever paying. The man Dermot called brother and the younger men called Uncle Coyle. She heard a chair scrape across the floor. Then Emmett's voice, still carrying the same calmness she had heard in the kitchen the night the stock had been ruined. 6 months, Emmett said. A little every month. You thought I wasn't counting. Coyle spoke at once, too quickly, saying there had been a mistake in the books, that he had advanced some money for other people and hadn't had time to record it yet, that he would bring the paperwork by tomorrow. Emmett let him finish. He didn't interrupt even once. Then, when Coyle stopped to breathe, he asked a single question. 2 days ago, I asked whether anything was wrong. You said no, is that right? Silence. Delaney still held the knife, but she was no longer cutting. At the kitchen door, Dermot stood as though nailed to the floor, his eyes fixed on the cutting board before him. There was no fist striking the table, no shouting. No one raised a hand against anyone. There was only Emmett's voice, even and slow, like a man reading from a list. You don't enter anywhere I have a stake, he said. Not here. Not the 2 places on Halsted Street. Not the warehouse on the south side. Not the restaurants leasing property from me. Coyle said several names Delaney didn't recognize, his voice beginning to break. Emmett continued as though he couldn't hear him. Tomorrow morning, people will call you and tell you they're fully staffed. Tomorrow afternoon, you'll call somewhere else, and they'll tell you they're fully staffed too. No one in this city hires you anymore, starting today. Then came a small sound, the sound of knees meeting the wooden floor. Delaney looked through the narrow opening in the door and saw Coyle on his knees, both hands gripping the edge of the desk, and she heard him speaking about a child in school, a mortgage, 22 years. Emmett stood. He fastened his coat, then stepped past the kneeling man the way someone might step around a chair left in the wrong place. No faster, no slower, without looking down. He went out. The door closed. Delaney set the knife down on the cutting board. She dried her hands, took off her apron, and went out through the back door, catching up with him beside the car parked tight against the wall in the alley beside the bar. He was opening the car door. "What's the difference between you and Mr. Prescott?" Emmett stopped with his hand still. He turned around, and this time, there was something on his face Delaney had never seen before. Not anger. Only the attention of a man who had just been asked a question no one had ever dared ask. Delaney stood 2 steps away, her apron draped over one arm. "You just told that man no one in this city would hire him again," she said. "You said it so quietly, like you were announcing a train schedule." Emmett didn't answer. "I went to 11 places, too," she continued. "They took my application, praised my cooking, told me they'd call. Then the next day they did call, and every one of them said the same thing. They were fully staffed. By the 11th place, someone felt sorry enough for me to tell me the truth. Somewhere in an insurance system, there was a piece of paper with my name on it, saying I was under investigation for stealing money. I never saw that paper. I don't know who sent it. I don't know what it says. But I know what it feels like to pick up the phone and call the 12th place." She paused. "They shut the whole city's doors on me, too. The only difference is that you said it to his face, and Mr. Prescott didn't have to say anything at all." The alley was very quiet then. Cars passed on the main street, and somewhere a garbage can lid struck in the wind. Emmett Kilbride stood there with one hand still resting on the top of the car door, silent for so long that Delaney thought he would get in, drive away, and tomorrow she would no longer have a job. She had prepared herself for that. She hadn't begged him for anything, hadn't asked him for a favor, and had no intention of doing so. When she had finished speaking, she turned away. Then his voice rose behind her. "That paper." Delaney stopped. "Which insurance company has it?" Emmett asked. "The full name." She turned back to look at him. He didn't explain why he was asking, and she didn't ask him why. She only gave him the name Otis Braddock had told her on the sidewalk that day. Emmett nodded once, got into the car, and closed the door. In the weeks that followed, Halloran's began to fill up in a way even Dermot couldn't explain. It was still the same bar, with the same wooden sign, the same 12 tables, but people began arriving earlier to make sure they could get a seat, and some customers, after ordering, would ask who was running the kitchen. One evening, an older woman at the table nearest the window insisted on waiting until the kitchen had finished cleaning before she would leave, just so she could shake Delaney's hand and tell her that the stew tasted exactly like the one her mother had made when she was a little girl. Delaney went home that night, sat in the kitchen of her 3rd-floor apartment, and for the first time since that night in the alley, took out paper and a pen and made a list. Not recipes, a list of things she would need if she ever had a place of her own. She put the paper away and told no one. Then one afternoon, Emmett called her into the back room, where an open folder lay on the desk, holding photographs of an empty storefront on Randolph Street, the former space of a bakery that had closed. "This place has been empty for 3 months, he said. "The kitchen still works. The plumbing is sound. I'll cover the repairs and the first 3 months of supplies." Delaney studied the photograph for a long time before looking up. "What share do you want?" Emmett Kilbride didn't answer at once. He slid the folder toward her. "My money goes in the books," he said. "Your name goes on the door." She asked him again, very clearly, what his share would be if the restaurant succeeded, and who would carry the loss if it failed. He answered both questions, plainly and without evasion. Then he added something she would remember for a long time. "I'm not buying your hands. I'm buying a seat in the books." She took the folder home. The next day, she laid the contract across the dining table in her apartment, waited until Ellis had gone to school, and read it. She read every line from beginning to end, underlined what she didn't understand, and wrote questions in the margins. That afternoon, she brought those questions back, listened to the explanations, and changed 2 clauses. That night, she read the whole thing again, slower than she had the first time. Only then did she sign it. At Halloran's, word that Emmett Kilbride was putting money behind a woman from the kitchen to open a place of her own spread within 2 days. No one discussed it in front of him. They talked about it elsewhere, in cars, outside the warehouse, at the table in the back of the bar after he had gone home. No connections, no one vouching for her, no one standing behind her. Just a woman who came from nowhere. Bergen said to Rudy one evening, then continued in the careful voice of a man weighing every word. He's never done anything like this before. Lately I've heard people saying he's getting soft. Rudy didn't answer that. He only looked toward the kitchen door, where Delaney was wiping down her knives before wrapping them in cloth, and said that the man who had knelt in the back room the other day had once believed he had someone standing behind him too. That was where the conversation ended. No one mentioned it again, but it didn't disappear. It only lay there, quiet as a pebble in a shoe. On the day she signed the lease, Delaney arrived half an hour early and stood alone in the old bakery, among wooden shelves still dusted with flour and a rusted industrial stove in the corner, beneath a high ceiling and stained walls, with white paint marks across the glass doors from when someone had painted them shut. She walked the room once, turned on the faucet to see whether the water still ran, opened the walk-in cooler to hear whether its hinges squeaked, stood where the line of burners would go, and held out her hand to judge the distance to the counter. When Emmett arrived, he found her standing that way in the middle of the empty room. "What are you going to call it?" he asked. Delaney lowered her hand. She looked toward the glass doors, where the letters would be, and spoke the name that had been waiting in her mind longer than she had realized. Martian Mother. Emmett nodded. He didn't ask why. At the Ferryman, the last person in the office had quit quite some time before, and Jerry never hired anyone to replace them, because paying someone to sit at a desk was one more salary he didn't want to carry. He had all the restaurant's correspondence and paperwork sent to its shared mailbox, gave the password to Trent, and told his nephew to check it from time to time and let him know if anything came in. Trent still did that at the end of each shift, after the kitchen had gone dark and he sat in the little room behind the bar adding up the order tickets. That night, there was a new email from the insurance company, with a subject line that read "Claim Confirmation" and an attachment inside. Trent opened it because he thought it concerned a policy renewal. The file contained 3 pages. The first was a form reporting the loss of assets, with checked boxes, a brief description stating that cash had gone missing from the register several times over the course of many months, and the name of the person accused, Delaney Marsh. The third page was the signature page. There were 2 signatures. One belonged to his uncle, the other sat in the witness box, and beneath it was Trent's name, written in full, including his middle name. Trent stared at that signature for a long time. It wasn't his handwriting, but it wasn't different enough for a stranger to notice, because it had been written by someone who had watched him sign bank papers since he was 18 years old. He had never signed that document. He had never seen it before. During the winter dated on that paper, he had still been attending culinary school nearly an hour's drive away, and he had never once set foot inside the ferryman's kitchen. He sat in that room without turning on another light, the glow of the screen falling across his face, and he remained there until the sounds of cleaning outside had gone completely quiet. Then he stood, went into the kitchen, and took down the thick plastic binder his uncle had patted and pointed to on Trent's first day. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting slanted slightly, small and even, written in blue ballpoint pen, with an occasional word crossed out and rewritten beside it. Page 2, the same hand. Page 10, still the same. Somewhere in the 40s, there was a note in the margin saying that batch had turned out too salty because of the old stock. Use less next time, with a date written beside it. He turned through the whole binder, page by page, and nowhere in it was there a single line in his uncle's handwriting. During those same weeks, on the other side of the city, Delaney sat in the small office behind Walt Doyle's seafood warehouse. She had come to place an order for her new restaurant, and while she waited for him to review the prices, she asked what seemed like an offhand question, whether the ferryman had owed him money during the winter before last. Walt Doyle gave a dry laugh and pulled open a filing cabinet. "Owed me?" he said. "They owed me all winter. I still have it all, because I never throw anything away." He pulled out a stack of invoices fastened with a metal clip and set them on the desk, and Delaney studied them one by one. November, unpaid. December, unpaid. January, partially paid. February, unpaid. She sat quietly for a long time. She had given Jerry that money in the middle of winter, given it because he said the restaurant couldn't make payroll, given it because he said everything would be different if they could just get through that season. But the fish supplier had never been paid. The vegetable supplier, when she called that evening, said exactly the same thing. So where had all that money gone? She still had photographs on her phone of several pages from the expense ledger that she had taken while she worked there, because Jerry had once asked her to help review food costs. She opened them, enlarged them, and traced every line from those months. Payroll, there. Utilities, there. Trash collection, there. And then, every month, without fail, an amount larger than all those other expenses combined, recorded under the same 4 words: premises service fee. No recipient's name, no contract number, only a string of account numbers. She wrote those numbers on a piece of paper. It took several more days, several phone calls, an afternoon in the notary office searching the building's business registration records, and one favor Walt Doyle asked of an acquaintance who worked as a commercial real estate broker in the neighborhood. At last, the name appeared at the end of the chain, printed on an ownership registration for that building number, that street, alongside the name of the management company and its legal representative. Delaney read that name 3 times. Then she folded the paper in half, slipped it into her coat pocket, and remained on the wooden bench in the hallway outside the notary office for a long time, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes fixed on the wall before her. She came to Halloran's in the afternoon, before opening, at the very hour when she knew he usually sat in the back room with his books. Dermot saw her face and asked nothing. He only stepped aside. She knocked twice, then opened the door herself. Emmett was sitting behind the desk, a stack of papers and an empty cup of coffee before him. He looked up. Delaney walked over, drew the paper from her coat pocket, smoothed it flat, and laid it on the desk directly in front of him, turning it the right way for him to read, exactly as someone had once placed a bundle of debt papers in front of Gerald Prescott. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She only stood there and asked one question. "Do you know where this money came from?" Emmett looked down at the paper. He didn't need long to read it, because he knew the company name printed there, knew the account number, knew that building number on that street, and knew exactly how the monthly payments recorded as premises service fees moved in and out of his books. He rested his hand on the edge of the paper, but didn't pick it up. $42,000, she said. "My mother's insurance money. She died. They paid it out. And I gave every cent to Mr. Prescott in the middle of winter, because he said he couldn't make payroll. The fish supplier wasn't paid. The vegetable supplier wasn't paid. But every month, a payment left the restaurant's account, regular as clockwork, on the same day, and it came here." Emmett said nothing. "You collected rent from that restaurant," she continued. "You held its loan. You went there yourself and made him sign the papers. So I'm asking you only one thing. Did you know where the money for that winter payment came from?" The only sound in the room was the low hum of the little refrigerator in the corner. Emmett Kilbride sat straight in his chair, both hands on the desk, and he answered without evasion, without lowering his voice, without trying to make the answer easier to hear. "I knew there was an unusual payment," he said. "When a restaurant that's 2 payments behind suddenly pays a lump sum like that, anyone would notice. I asked him. Once, he said it was his money, that he had sold some old things. And you believed him?" "I didn't check," Emmett said. Delaney looked at him. "Why? In my line of work," he said. "When a debtor pays, that's the end of it. Where they got the money, who they borrowed it from, what they sold, that's their business. I collect the right amount, on time. I don't ask where their money came from." He paused, and the next thing he said came more slowly, as though he had only just heard it clearly himself. "I never asked anyone that question." Delaney stood still. She had walked all the way there with anger waiting in her chest, and she had prepared herself for every kind of answer, for him to deny it, for him to say it was business, for him to tell her not to interfere. She hadn't prepared herself for him to admit it so plainly, without a single word in his own defense, and she realized that was the hardest part to bear, because it gave her nowhere to put her anger. She looked at the paper on the desk for a while longer, then she spoke one last time. "My mother worked as a cook for 30 years. Not once in her life did she have a month when she didn't have to count grocery money. That money was the only thing she left my brother and me, and it is sitting in your books under 4 words, premises service fees." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked out, leaving the paper on the desk. Emmett Kilbride didn't call her back. He didn't rise, didn't reach for her, didn't say a single word to keep her there 1 second longer. The door closed. Outside, the bar was beginning to open. Chairs scraped against the floor, glasses touched together, and someone switched on the lights behind the counter. He remained where he was. The empty coffee cup remained where it was. The paper stayed in the center of the desk, turned the right way for him to read, and he neither picked it up nor put it away. Late that night, when Dermot came in to ask whether he needed anything, the light in the room still hadn't been turned on. 6 weeks passed, and no one came to renew the ferryman's lease again. On the exact day it expired, not 1 day early and not 1 day late, 2 men in dark coats arrived at the restaurant before it opened, handed Jerry a sheet of paper, waited for him to read it, then left. No one raised their voice. No one struck anything. There was only that piece of paper and the long silence that followed. Jerry spent the entire morning making calls, calling the bank, calling 2 old friends, calling a man who had once invested alongside him years before, and by noon, he stopped calling. He sat at the desk in the office, where a bundle of debt papers had once been laid before him, and he knew he had only one thing left to sell. The house on the west side of the city, the house where he had lived since his wife was alive, went on the market that week for less than its value because he needed money quickly. Not a good price. The real estate agent asked whether he was sure. Jerry told him to do it. In the ferryman's kitchen, everything kept moving, but it moved like a machine with every screw worked loose. Fewer customers came in, fewer order tickets appeared, and some nights they opened only half the tables. Trent remained at the stove. He lasted another 2 weeks after the night. He sat in the dark room with the 3-page attachment and the thick plastic binder. He didn't say one word to his uncle about it. He simply worked every shift, cleaned the entire kitchen, and then one morning he arrived earlier than usual, took off the apron that had become old and stained, folded it, and laid it on the office desk. He placed the thick plastic binder beside it. On its cover, he left a sheet of paper with exactly 2 handwritten lines. "I'm not the head chef. I never was." Then he walked out through the front door, not the back, and did not turn to look at the sign. A few blocks away, the old bakery on Randolph Street had been stripped of the white paint across its glass doors. The new cooking line had been installed, the walk-in cooler was running, the floor had been cleaned, and one space on the wall behind the counter had been left bare, waiting for something to be hung there. Delaney worked there from morning until late at night for weeks, and during those days, there was one appointment she had been waiting for. Constance Whitlock arrived one afternoon, alone, without scheduling far in advance. The woman who ran the largest charitable foundation in the area and who ordered one dinner for 200 guests every year, along with dozens of smaller events. She walked through the restaurant, asked a few questions about the kitchen, tasted 2 dishes Delaney prepared for her on the spot, set down her spoon, then sat up straighter. "I have nothing to say about the food," she said. "I'm asking you about something else." Delaney stood across from her, wiping her hands on her apron. "Go ahead." "I've heard this place was opened with money from the Kilbride family," Mrs. Whitlock said. "I won't dance around it. Where did the money to open this restaurant come from, Miss Marsh?" The only sounds in the restaurant were the air conditioning and cars passing on the street outside. Delaney could have said she had borrowed from a bank. She could have said it was savings. She could have said any number of things, and Mrs. Whitlock would have had no way to verify them that afternoon. Instead, Delaney pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "That's right," she said. "Mr. Emmett Kilbride paid for the renovations and the first 3 months of supplies. The contract was notarized, and I read it twice before I signed it. His share is clearly written there. He has no authority to make decisions in the kitchen, no authority to decide the menu, no authority to decide whom I hire or fire. My name is on the business license. I'm willing to show you the entire contract, and if you want, I'll show you every account record from the first day." Mrs. Whitlock said nothing. She watched Delaney for a long moment with the look of someone who had spent decades in a position that required her to judge other people. "You know I asked 3 other people before I asked you, don't you?" she said. "I assumed you did. Every one of them told me to stay far away from this place." Delaney nodded. "I understand. But none of those 3 people dared tell me what you just did," Mrs. Whitlock said. "They hinted. They left me to draw my own conclusions. They kept their own hands clean. You're the only person who answered my question directly." She opened her bag, took out a prepared contract she had brought with her, laid it on the table, and drew out a pen. "I work with people who tell the truth," she said. "With people who tell the truth. At least I know where to begin asking questions." The night before opening day, Delaney left the restaurant when everything was finished. The meat had been portioned, the bones blanched, the vegetables washed, and the 2 crates of seafood Walt Doyle had delivered that afternoon sat in the walk-in cooler, alongside every item she had ordered for the opening reception, with Mrs. Whitlock and nearly 100 guests expected. She checked the cooler door twice, turned off the lights, locked the front door, went home, and managed 3 hours of sleep. She came back while it was still dark, unlocked the door, switched on the lights, and the first thing she noticed was not with her eyes but against the skin of her face. The restaurant was warm. The cooler door stood wide open, held in place by a plastic chair so it could not close on its own, and the light inside had gone out because the machine had shut down long ago. She stepped inside. She reached out and touched the top crate of seafood, then pulled her hand back. She opened the meat container and smelled it. Then she straightened up and touched nothing else, because there was no point in touching anything else. The entire stockroom, every last bit of it, was beyond saving. She called Dermot because his was the quickest number she could dial, and in less than an hour, 4 people had arrived at her restaurant, none of them people she had invited. Rudy came last. He walked around once, bent down to inspect the plastic chair blocking the door, checked the lock on the back entrance, then went outside and stood on the phone for a long while. Near noon, Emmett arrived at Halloran's, and Rudy went into the back room to report. The man who had opened the cooler was a local handyman, someone who had worked there for half an hour and left, and he talked quickly because he did not belong to anyone. What mattered was the person who had paid him. Rudy put a scrap of paper with a name written on it onto the desk, then said the name aloud to make certain. "It wasn't Prescott," Rudy said. "Prescott is selling his house. He doesn't have money left to hire anyone for this." The one who paid was the owner of the restaurant at the corner of Randolph and Peoria, 2 blocks from Miss Marsh's place. Emmett said nothing. Rudy continued. "He rents one of your spaces. He saw her take Mrs. Whitlock's contract, saw his regular customers asking when the new place would open, and he got scared. That's all there was to it." The room fell quiet for a moment. Then Emmett Kilbride stood. He asked no more questions, gave Rudy no instructions, said nothing about what he was thinking. He reached for the coat, draped over the back of his chair, put it on, fastened the top button, and walked toward the door. Rudy followed behind him, and Dermot, standing at the bar, put down the cloth in his hand and followed too, and neither man asked where Emmett was going. Delaney had been at Halloran since morning because it was the only place with an empty kitchen where she could think about what to do next. She heard the door, saw him walk past, looked at his face once, then set down her pen and followed. By the time she reached the alley, he had opened the car door. "Where are you going?" Emmett did not turn around. He lifted one hand to the roof of the car door, and that was the only answer she received. Delaney stepped forward, walked around the front of the car, and stood directly in the open doorway, between him and the driver's seat. Rudy stood a few steps away. Dermot stood by the restaurant's back door. Both men knew no one had ever stood in front of Emmett Kilbride's car door, and neither of them moved. "I know what you intend to do," Delaney said. "You don't have to say it, and I don't need you to." Emmett looked at her. "My restaurant opens tomorrow. My mother's name is on the glass. Mrs. Whitlock will be there, and nearly 100 other people will be there too, and they will eat what I cook, then go home and tell other people about it. That is what I want people to remember about that restaurant." She took a breath. "If you do this tonight, they will still come tomorrow, they will still eat, and they will still praise it. But next week, when they hear what happened to the man at the corner of Peoria, that restaurant will not be mine anymore. It will be yours. People will not come because of what I cook. They will come because they are afraid, or because they are curious, or because they want to stand close to you. And I will stand in that kitchen for the rest of my life, without ever knowing whether what I made was worth anything." The alley was very quiet. Emmett Kilbride stood there, one hand still resting on the roof of the car door, looking at her longer than he ever had before. In his entire life, no one had ever stopped him. People might beg him, kneel in front of him, say every possible thing, but no one had ever stood between him and a car door and told him he could not go. He lowered his hand. He pushed the car door shut, the sound so soft that Rudy could hear the latch catch. Then Emmett turned, walked back into the restaurant, and past Dermot where he stood without saying a word. Rudy watched him go, then looked at Delaney, and understood that what had just happened in that alley would reach other people's ears before nightfall. That afternoon, Delaney sat in her restaurant beside a walk-in cooler that had been scrubbed clean and stood completely empty, with a sheet of paper before her listing everything she would need for nearly 100 guests at noon the next day. There wasn't enough money in her account to buy back even half of it. The wholesale market opened at dawn, and by then she would have less than 8 hours left to cook. She called Mrs. Whitlock and told her the truth. Mrs. Whitlock listened, fell silent for a moment, then asked how much time she needed. "I'll let you know before midnight," Delaney said. She set down the phone and sat alone in that brightly lit restaurant, and for the first time since the night in the alley, she thought about calling to postpone everything. Around 11 that night, her phone buzzed. Walt Doyle had sent one line, telling her to be at the seafood warehouse at 4 in the morning and to bring her car. She called back at once, but he didn't let her finish a sentence about money. He told her he hadn't portioned out that day's stock for anyone yet, that he had set some aside, and that they could settle the money next month. Then he hung up, because men his age did not like to talk too long. At 4 in the morning, the warehouse lights came on while the rest of the market was still dark. Walt Doyle stood there with his 2 sons, and inside the warehouse foam coolers had already been lined up in rows, the fish had been scaled, and several trays of oysters had been washed. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He only pointed to each container and said this was the best thing they had that week. This was for cooking. This was for grilling, then told his sons to carry them out to her car. Delaney reached the restaurant before dawn, and when she opened the back door, the kitchen lights were already on. Otis Braddock stood at the sink with his sleeves rolled up, and the apron she had left hanging there the night before was gone from its hook. He was tying it around his waist. When he saw her, he gave one nod, and the first thing he said was not a greeting but a question about whether she planned to cook the main course over high heat or low heat. Then he went to work, moving as though he had stood in that kitchen for years, rather than having just left his shift at his own steakhouse to come there. A car pulled up outside. The back door opened, and Rudy came in carrying a cooler filled with ice in both arms. He said nothing and looked at no one. He walked straight into the cooler, set it down, then went back to the car for the second one. Behind him came 2 other men Delaney recognized by sight but did not know by name, carrying coolers too, saying nothing too. They brought everything in, stacked it neatly, checked that the refrigeration was running, then stood in the corner of the kitchen to see whether anything else needed carrying. None of them said who had sent them. As daylight began to gather at the end of the street, someone knocked on the back door. Delaney opened it and found Trent Prescott standing there, both hands in his coat pockets, his face unshaven, looking as though he hadn't slept properly in several nights. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He only looked past her shoulder into the kitchen, saw the vegetables piled in 2 large baskets with the dirt still on them, then said he knew how to pick vegetables over, and asked whether she would let him in. Delaney stood in the doorway for 3 breaths. Then she stepped aside. He came in, found a low stool in the corner, pulled the basket of vegetables close, and sat down to work without asking anyone another question for the next 2 hours. By the time the sun had fully risen, that kitchen was running. Otis stood at the hotline. Dermot had arrived sometime without anyone noticing and was handling the stock. The 2 kitchen assistants Delaney had hired the week before followed Otis's instructions without needing anyone to introduce them. Rudy and the other 2 men had finished carrying in the ice and stayed to set up tables in the dining room. Trent sat in the corner with the second basket of vegetables. Pans clattered, knives struck cutting boards, someone called for more dry towels, and steam rose toward the lights. Delaney stood in the middle of the kitchen, still holding the sheet of paper with the list that she no longer needed, and looked around once. She looked at Otis's back before the line of flames. She looked at Walt Doyle pushing through the door with the last container. She looked at Rudy setting up the final table in the dining room. She looked at the young man in the corner sorting vegetables, and she thought of the night she had stood alone in the alley, when there hadn't been a single person in the world who had stepped outside with her. She turned toward the cabinet where the towels were kept and stood there, and for the first time in all those months, she couldn't hold herself together any longer. No one in the kitchen turned to look. Otis spoke a little louder than usual about the flame on the 3rd burner being weak, and everyone stayed busy answering him. The news reached her through Walt Doyle, who had heard it from a delivery man, who in turn had heard it from a former employee of the ferryman. Gerald Prescott had collapsed in his restaurant one afternoon, alone, among tables shoved into a corner and chairs turned upside down on top of them. The man who found him had come from the sign company to take down the restaurant's name. The doctors said he was exhausted, his blood pressure was high, and for weeks he had barely eaten or slept properly. Delaney listened to all of it, thanked Walt, then went back to her work and said nothing more that afternoon. That evening, after the kitchen was cleaned, she took a clean plastic container, spooned the remaining stew from the pot into it, sealed the lid, and placed it in a paper bag. She told no one where she was going. The hospital stood on the west side of the city, and his room was on the 3rd floor, a 4-bed room, his bed the one farthest inside beside the window. He was sitting propped against his pillows when she entered, and when he recognized who stood at the foot of his bed, he turned his face away. She said nothing. She pulled over a plastic chair, set the paper bag on the small rolling table, then sat down. In the room, there was the sound of the heart monitor from the neighboring bed, and someone watching television very softly in the bed nearest the door. Jerry looked out the window for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice rough and low, stripped of the volume of the man who had once stood in the kitchen doorway pointing toward the parking lot. "My brother died 7 years ago," he said. Delaney did not answer. "There were only the 2 of us," he continued. "He was in the hospital for 5 months. In the last month, he couldn't speak anymore. He only held my hand. Trent was 17 then. His mother had been gone a long time, and there was no one left in that house. On the day of the funeral, I stood beside the coffin and promised him I would take care of that boy properly. I said it out loud, in front of everyone." He raised a hand and rubbed his face. "I sent him to culinary school. 3 years of tuition. I paid for it with money from the restaurant, and I told him that when he finished, he would come back here, that this place would be his. I told him that from before he could even hold a knife the right way." Delaney sat still. She looked at the paper bag on the table, not at him. "Then he graduated," Jerry said. "He came back, and you were in that kitchen." He stopped for a long while. "I knew," he said. "Don't think I didn't know. I knew whose menu it was. I knew who stayed until 2 in the morning the night the electrical cabinet caught fire. I knew that winter, if it hadn't been for you, I would have shut the place down in January. I knew all of it." He turned and looked at her for the first time since she had entered. "But you were alive," he said. "My brother wasn't. And I kept thinking that a promise to someone who had gone into the ground could never be changed, while there was always still time with someone who was alive. I thought I would pay you back later. I thought that in a few years, when the boy was standing on his own feet, I would find a way to give it back to you. I thought that every day." His voice broke there, and he had to stop. Then he finished. "I traded you for the boy, and then I lost the boy too." In the room, the television at the bed nearest the door shifted to the weather report. Delaney remained sitting for a while longer. She did not say it was all right. She did not say she understood. She did not tell him not to think about it anymore. She did not say anything that might make that man feel lighter, because she did not owe him that, and because she could not do it yet. She stood. She opened the paper bag, took out the container of food, set it on the rolling table, and pushed the table close enough to his bed for him to reach. She loosened the lid slightly so the steam could escape. Then she pushed the plastic chair back where it had been and walked out. At the door, she paused for one breath without turning around, then continued into the hallway. Gerald Prescott lay there looking at the container on the table for a long time before reaching for it. He opened the lid, and the scent that rose from it was the same scent he had smelled every evening for 5 years in his own restaurant, without ever once stopping in the kitchen to ask who had cooked it. Ellis's birthday fell on a Sunday, and the restaurant was closed on Sundays, so Delaney came home early that morning, carrying 2 bags of groceries, and the leather-bound notebook she had not opened since the night it had lain beneath a puddle of water. She set it on the kitchen table, opened it to the final page, and found it exactly as it had been the last time she saw it. The paper had dried long ago, but it had dried in ripples, and the blue ink had bled into patches, swallowing most of those small, neat, slanting lines of handwriting. She could still read the name of the dish at the top of the page. She could still make out a few scattered words in the middle. Everything else was only a blur. Their mother had cooked this dish twice a year, exactly on the birthdays of her 2 children, and never on any other occasion. Delaney began to cook from memory. She started from the beginning, carefully, in the same way she worked at the restaurant, and when she ladled some into a bowl to taste, she set the spoon down at once. It wasn't wrong in the way ruined food was wrong. It simply wasn't that taste. She poured it out, washed the pot, and made it again, this time using less seasoning, cooking it longer, keeping the flame lower. She tasted it. Still not right. She stood before the stove with the spoon in her hand, feeling like someone standing one step from a door and unable to find the handle. Ellis woke close to noon, came into the kitchen with his hair sticking up, caught the scent, and stopped short in the doorway. "You're making that dish?" "Yes." The boy pulled a chair over and sat on the counter, watching the third pot come together in silence for a long while. Delaney cooked it a third time, and near the end, just as she reached for the handful of herbs and the final ingredient to add to the pot, she heard Ellis behind her. "Wait." She stopped. The boy tilted his head as he watched the stove. "Mom didn't do it like that," he said. Delaney turned around. "What do you mean?" "Mom turned off the stove first," Ellis said. "I remember. She turned it off, waited a little for it to stop boiling, then put that in and covered the pot. I remember because when I was little, I thought she had forgotten. I even ran in to remind her, and she told me to sit down, that it wasn't finished yet, to wait." Delaney stood still. She looked at the open gas knob, at the broth trembling in a gentle boil around the edges of the pot, and remembered something that had never occurred to her through either of the first two attempts. That final ingredient needed only the heat of the pot, not the flame, and if it boiled, it lost everything. She turned the gas knob off. The pot stopped boiling. She waited. She waited longer than she thought was necessary, while Ellis sat on the counter, swinging his legs. "You made everything right," he said. "You just cooked it too long." Delaney laughed, a sound that escaped before she could hold it back. Then she dropped in the handful of herbs and the final ingredient, covered the pot, and stood there with one hand still resting on the lid. When she opened it, the scent that rose made them both fall silent at once. Ellis jumped down from the counter. That's it, sis." They ate right there at the kitchen table, 2 bowls, no plates, no arrangement of any kind. Ellis finished his first bowl, then got up to ladle himself a second, and while he did, he told her about school, about the chemistry teacher making the entire class ruin an experiment, about something he and 2 friends were planning to start, something Delaney still could not understand no matter how long he explained it. She sat and listened, eating slowly, and once she set her spoon down simply to look at the boy while he talked. "What are you smiling about?" Ellis asked. "Nothing," she said. "Eat." At the end of the meal, he stood, carried both bowls to the sink, turned on the faucet, and washed them himself, because that had been the rule in their home since their mother was alive. Delaney reached for the notebook, opened it to the final page, and looked at the blurred stains of ink for a while. Then she picked up a pen and, in the strip of white margin still left at the bottom, wrote one more line. The opening celebration went perfectly from beginning to end, and Mrs. Whitlock stayed until the last guest had gone, then rose and shook Delaney's hand in front of everyone still lingering in the dining room. After that came weeks so busy that Delaney could barely remember where she had slept. The restaurant opened 6 days a week. Every table was full from Wednesday night on, and on the front window, painted in old-fashioned white lettering, were the words Marsh and Mother. Emmett Kilbride came in late one evening, when nearly all the guests had left, and the tables were being wiped down. He entered through the front door without a reservation, and sat at the small table against the wall. Delaney came out of the kitchen, dried her hands, and sat across from him. Between them stood a water pitcher and 2 glasses. She did not ease into it. "That night you sat in your car," she said. "You saw everything. Why didn't you come down?" Emmett did not ask which night she meant. He had known this question was coming, perhaps since that afternoon in Halloran's kitchen, when she had walked toward him with both hands still wet. He turned his glass once on the tabletop, then laid his hand down. "I could have come down," he said. "If I had, he would have apologized to you right there. He would have taken you back that night. The next morning, you would have gone back into that kitchen. The recipe book would still have been in the cabinet. Your title would still have been sous chef, and your $42,000 would still have been sitting somewhere nobody mentioned." He looked up at her. "If I had stepped out of that car that night, you would still be standing in that kitchen today, and he would still believe he owned you." Delaney sat quietly. She had thought about that answer many times through all those months, imagined it in every possible way, and none of them had resembled what she had just heard. She also knew it was both true and not enough, that behind it remained a man who had sat still and watched a woman kneel on wet concrete to gather her things, then chosen not to move. She did not say she forgave him, she only said something else. "You tested me." Emmett did not deny it. "The drawer beneath the work table," she said. "For 3 days. I opened it 3 times. I was short on that month's rent then." "I tested everyone," he said. It was the only way I knew how to see what kind of person someone was, and it had never been wrong. He paused. You were the first person I regretted testing. He took a paper envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket, placed it on the table, and pushed it toward her. This isn't meant to buy back anything, he said. You'll understand when you open it. Delaney opened the envelope. Inside were documents establishing an education savings account, with Ellis Marsh named as the beneficiary, and on the line below, the name of the person who had set it up was her mother's name. The amount in it was $42,000. She read every page, then looked up. What money is this? My money, Emmett said. Not money from where I work. Not borrowed money. Not money anyone gave me. My own money. You gave him $42,000 to save a restaurant, and it flowed into my account over 2 winters. And I never asked a single question. I can't buy that back. I can only stop feeding on what belongs to other people. Delaney looked at the papers in her hand. Why didn't you give it directly to me? Because you wouldn't have taken it, he said. She sat silent for a long time. Then she folded the papers, put them back into the envelope, and set it at the edge of the table on her side. She did not thank him. She only nodded once, and they both understood that it was enough. The leather-bound notebook lay at the end of the table because she had just brought it out to note a change to next week's menu. Emmett reached over and drew it toward himself, then turned a few pages, slowly and carefully, like a man who knew he was touching something that mattered. When he reached a page near the middle, he stopped. In the margin beside the recipe, her mother had added a short line in her small slanted handwriting, saying that she had learned the dish from a woman who sold food on Halsted Street. Emmett read that line. Then he read it again. He sat quietly, his hand still resting at the edge of the page, and his face did not change, but something in the way he breathed had. Delaney watched him. Did you know her? When I was 12. That winter there was no one left in my house to cook, he said. There was a woman selling food on the corner of Halsted Street who fed me for months without asking me a single question, without asking whose child I was, without asking when I would pay her back. He said nothing more. He closed the notebook, pushed it back toward her, and the two of them sat for a long while in that dining room, with most of the lights turned off, neither of them speaking. Gerald Prescott came in one afternoon in the middle of the week, when the restaurant was still quiet, and Delaney was standing at the far prep table portioning food. He had grown much thinner. His coat hung a size too large on him, and he stood near the door for a while before finally coming all the way inside. She dried her hands, walked out, and did not invite him to sit down. He said he had a place, a small storefront on the west side, that someone was willing to invest with him, and that if she came back to cook, they could have it rebuilt within a year, that this time there would be proper paperwork, that she could have whatever share she wanted. He said it all in one breath, like a man who had rehearsed it in his mind for weeks. When he finally stopped, Delaney spoke, very softly. You've been talking for several minutes, she said, and not one of those words was an apology for that night. He opened his mouth to answer, but she went on. You're sorry your restaurant closed, so this apology is for my hands, not for me. Jerry stood still. He couldn't argue with a single word, because she was right, and both of them standing in that restaurant that day knew she was right. He nodded slowly, then turned toward the door. Delaney called him back. She went into the small room behind the counter, wrote down an address on a piece of paper, then came back out and handed it to him. In Cicero, she said. It's the family diner run by the fish seller I know. They're open all night, and they need a night shift manager. It isn't your place. If you go, you work for wages, 6 days a week. He took the slip of paper, looked at it, then looked at her. Why would you do that? Because I know what it feels like to call the 11th place, she said. He folded the paper, slipped it into his coat pocket, and walked out. At the door, he paused for one breath before pushing it open. Trent Prescott came one morning, standing at the back door as he had before, and this time he said plainly from the start that he wanted to learn again from the beginning, that he would wash dishes for 3 months without pay, and that he knew he had no right to ask for anything. Delaney listened to all of it before answering. I'm not taking you on because of whose nephew you are, she said. I'm taking you on because you're the only person in that house who dared to say you haven't earned your place yet. Then she added that he would still be paid, because no one worked for free in her kitchen, and she pointed toward the sink. He began that very morning. Marisol Vega came before daylight one day, standing at the back door, 19 years old, with no resume and no experience. And when Delaney asked what she knew how to do, the girl said she knew nothing at all but learned quickly. Delaney looked at her for a while, and she remembered another alley, another sink, and a man who had told someone to make her a plate of food. She opened the door wider. She took a new apron from its hook, handed it to the girl, and said, "Someone opened a door for me when I had even less than you do now." On the wall behind the counter, where there had once been an empty patch with nothing hanging there was now a frame. Inside was a rippled page, marked with bleeding ink, its words impossible to read, and at the very bottom was one additional line written in fresh pen. When customers asked, Delaney only said it was the final page from her mother's notebook, and she explained no more. On Saturday night, Emmett Kilbride came in through the front door and asked, "Which table am I sitting at tonight?" Delaney looked out at the dining room, already full, then tipped her head toward the kitchen, where a wooden chair stood against the wall beside the place where she worked. He went in, sat down there, and remained quiet through the entire shift, like someone who had known that place for a long time. Ellis, 16 years old, was helping serve on weekends. He carried the first bowl of the evening to table 1, set it down carefully, then returned to the kitchen for the next one. Anyone could repaint the name on a door, and anyone could copy a recipe. What no one could copy was a person who knew they weren't good enough yet and was willing to begin again at the dish sink, and another person generous enough to open the door and let them come inside. Respect for another person's labor isn't mere politeness. It is the one thing that keeps a kitchen, a home, and a human life from going cold. If Delaney's story has touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that we can keep bringing you more compelling stories every day. Please tell us how this story made you feel. We sincerely hope to read the words that come from the deepest part of your heart in the comments. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.